World Regions Geography, Middle East and North Africa, Part 3, Economy, Accumulation, and Production of Inequality. So in the Eastern Mediterranean Crescent, we have Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, and Turkey, and the Maghreb is Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And these are really kind of economic regions where the economies are interrelated. And the Maghreb, of course, is in North Africa, stretches along North Africa. This is along the Mediterranean Asian coast. And the Union of the Mediterranean is a combination of this group and the European Union in kind of a trading group so that it helps out the economies of both regions. And you have this production of social inequalities. And what I want you to look at here is this is the economy in select countries based on the segment that it makes up. So you have mining and utilities in gray, which that includes your oil production. So you can see which countries are most dependent. Agriculture, you see none almost there. Manufacturing, very little. Construction, some very little. Wholesale, retail, restaurants, and hotels. Transportation, storage, and communication, and other activities. Now here's the composition of the labor market, and this is the real telling factor. National public, so this is your labor, where your labor segments are. This is nationals. In other words, people who are, if it's in Saudi Arabia, they're Saudis. So national public employment and national private employment. But the largest section is private expats. So in Bahrain, most of the people are from outside. Expats are simply anyone who is external to the nationals. So if they bring in laborers, like a few years ago, Saudi Arabia sought a agreement with Vietnam and signed an agreement to hire a certain number of Vietnamese laborers at a given price. 250,000 Vietnamese were sent to work in Saudi Arabia on contract by the government. Qatar, most of everything done in the country is done by people from outside the country. Same in Oman. The vast majority of the workforce, because it's these two segments right here, the vast majority of the workforce is outside the country. So the nationals are doing very little of anything within the economy. And so what you have is a permanent subsidized population. And the consequence of that is frustration because there's no jobs. And what you're seeing right now, like in Saudi Arabia, is trying to move away from this, particularly from this segment. And this is a real problem because they're having to invest billions and billions of dollars to take people off of public employment and force them to go out and get jobs in the private industry. And basically, like in Saudi Arabia, what people were used to is having a government job. If they were educated, they had a government job, and they didn't do much of anything, and they got paid a lot of money to do it. And now they're having to compete in the private market. Territory and politics. It's no surprise to anybody in the class, I'm sure, There's a lot of intra-regional conflict. Intra means internal. So when we talk about intra-regional conflict, we're talking about the Kurds versus the Turks, Kurds versus Iraqi Arabs, Kurds versus Iranians. You're talking about Arabs versus Persians, or Arabs versus Iranians. You're talking about Palestinians and Jews, Arabs and Jews. So all of these groups fighting. And then you get down to Sudan, and you got the Janjaweed, which are Arab-born Africans. So they're more Arab than black. And the incredible genocide that went on in Darfur was the Arabs versus black Africans, African Arabs versus black Africans, and the attempt by the Arabs to exterminate the black Africans. There's a lot of internally displaced persons, and that includes in the Sudan region. It includes throughout Syria, Iraq, Palestinians. These are all internally displaced persons. And when you have that sort of a situation, particularly when it's long term, like in the Palestinian situation, you have an incredible amount of animosity and an incredible amount of conflict that is not going to be easily put aside. Now, territory and politics. This is kind of, if you look at these, it's kind of the history of Israel. This is when the area that is now Israel and the West Bank, Palestine, was simply Palestine. In other words, Palestine was a British mandate. And then in following World War II, well, actually in the 20s and 30s, the British encouraged Jewish migration into Palestine. At first it was fairly peaceful, and then after World War II, the United Nations decided to create a Jewish state. And that's this gold part right here. This Jewish state was created, and Jerusalem was divided half Jewish, half Arab. The problem was the Arabs that formerly lived in this region were not too happy. The Palestinians, they were forced here into the West Bank, into this enclave here, and into the Gaza and this region right here. And that was not a very happy situation. So you had a war in 1949. And the result was this. So in other words, the Jews took this part and a large part here out of the Gaza. There's a little bit there now left of Gaza. And they took some of this region and this region up here. And then you had the 1967 war, which was called the 6-Day War. Egypt and Syria decided to, and Lebanon decided to invade. And Israel took the Golan Heights, which is this area of Syria, took the West Bank, and took control of the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. And they held that for quite some time. And then through negotiations led by the United States, Israel, and Egypt, settled, signed a peace treaty, and Israel returned this area to Egypt, and this was designated as the Gaza Strip, Palestinian area. This was the West Bank, but as you see, they had moved and taken over all of Jerusalem, And Lebanon, this area that they had taken from Lebanon was given back to Lebanon. And Hezbollah is largely in this southern Lebanon area, this area that borders on Israel. And as of 2/15, this is the current border, and you have, this is the Palestinian Liberation Organization governs this West Bank, and Hamas governs this region, and this region up in here is governed by Hezbollah. Hezbollah is strong all the way across here, Syria and Lebanon. There are some nuclear tensions. Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran is developing nuclear weapons. That is creating some nuclear tensions. Iraq had previously tried to develop some nuclear weapons, but they were actually, their facilities were destroyed by Israel. The rise of ISIS. ISIS has created this caliphate. They're currently losing a lot of territory, and there's been a lot of genocide going on, and it is a very unstable region at this point. There are some regional alliances that have risen over time. The Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, those are groups that have tried to stabilize it and have tried to unite. The Arab League in particular had tried to unite groups against Israel, Arab states, and I think you're going to continue to see a lot of instability and a lot of issues. Political unrest, change, and repression. So you all are sure aware of the Arab Spring, what's the ongoing civil war in Syria, which has really allowed for ISIS to wrest a lot of control. The instability brought on by the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and the warfare between the Shia and the Sunnis. The Kurds call for their own homeland. The role of social media in this. These groups are much more sophisticated, and they use social media extensively, whether it's showing beheadings or battle footage. They use a lot of social media. There has been some democratic and economic reforms. You're seeing economic reforms in Saudi Arabia, democratic reforms across the region. But what you're really seeing is a different form of democracy, not necessarily the type of democracy that we would see in the United States. And it's because you have a different cultural basis. And you've seen the rise of this group, ISIS. This is their area of control. If you notice, they don't really control very wide. They're controlling highways, oil transportation, refineries. It's not very extensive control. They don't really control the hinterlands. They control the large cities and populations in certain areas, and that's even deteriorating with increased pressure from both the U.S., Russia, and Arab countries that are currently in the area, and their armies are getting better and better at fighting ISIS.